Today, we're examining a conflict with global market implications. Donald Trump's escalating battle with Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell. Trump has repeatedly blasted Powell, demanding swift interest rate cuts, and criticizing the Fed for moving to slowly pointing to Europe as a model. Powell, in contrast, has stayed measured, defending the Fed's independence and data-driven approach. Recently, Trump grew even more aggressive, hinting at firing Powell and warning of dire economic consequences if rates weren't cut. Powell responded by reminding the public that the president can't simply remove the Fed chair. Despite briefly walking back his threats, Trump continued mocking Powell with nicknames like Too Late Powell. At its core, the standoff is simple. Trump wants fast rate cuts. Powell isn't budging. Stakes for the market are high. Welcome to Stewardship Finance Academy. Our channel is dedicated to helping you become a confident investor. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe to our channel to stay updated with valuable market insights like these. The U.S. government's main priority now is to ease fiscal pressure by lowering borrowing costs, meaning lower interest rates, and to weaken the dollar to help American manufacturing. Both goals require the Federal Reserve to cut rates, which has become the administration's main focus. To push this, Trump has publicly pressured Fed Chair Jerome Powell, while Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has taken a more diplomatic approach. The Fed, however, remains committed to its mandate, controlling inflation and ensuring stability. Although inflation has stayed below 3% and the Fed cut rates by 100 basis points last year, it has since paused further cuts due to policy uncertainty from Trump's tariffs. This reflects classic conflicting priorities. The White House pushing for aggressive rate cuts, the Fed insisting on data and caution. Such tensions aren't new. U.S. presidents and the Fed have always had a complex, sometimes contentious relationship, shaped by different goals and mandates. To understand today's standoff, we need to look back. Over the last century, the Fed has fought 8 major battles for its independence-defining moments in its relationship with the White House. The Federal Reserve was created in 1913 as an independent but supervised central bank. In practice, early Fed policy closely followed the Treasury's lead with only modest autonomy. The Fed's first major clash came during the Great Depression. Tied to the gold standard, the Fed was forced to tighten money when the economy needed stimulus most. Gold reserves fell sharply as the public demanded gold for dollars, limiting the Fed's power to respond. President Roosevelt ended the gold standard in 1934 with the Gold Reserve Act, transferring gold and control to the Treasury. The Fed lost even more independence, acting largely as an extension of Treasury priorities. World War II financing further diminished the Fed's autonomy. It was required to buy Treasury bonds at low fixed rates, making it essentially a tool of the Treasury. After World War II, the government wanted the Fed to continue supporting cheap borrowing during the Korean War. This time, the Fed resisted, citing runaway inflation. Tensions peaked when the Treasury falsely claimed the Fed had agreed to keep rates low. The Fed publicly pushed back. After tough negotiations, the 1951 Accord granted the Fed authority to stop buying bonds at fixed rates, marking the start of its modern independence. The agreement came at a price. Chair McCabe resigned and was replaced by Treasury insider William McChesney. Martin Jr., though Martin would soon defy expectations. Far from a compliant appointee, William McChesney Martin Jr. became the longest-serving Fed chair, holding office for 19 years and cementing true central bank independence. Martin's impressive career spanned Wall Street, the military, and the Treasury before he took the helm at the Fed. Principled, but pragmatic. He worked with government leaders when needed but refused to compromise on price stability. During his tenure, inflation averaged just 1.3%, turning the era, the nickname Martin Miracle. Martin also began the tradition of informal but open communication with the Treasury, balancing collaboration with independence. His leadership showed that autonomy isn't just granted by LUT, must be maintained through discipline and resolve in the face of political pressure. Today's ongoing Fed-White House tensions echo past battles, but thanks to figures like Martin, the Fed is better prepared to defend its role as guardian of economic stability. By 1965, the Vietnam War was straining U.S. finances. President Johnson pressed Fed Chair William McChesney Martin Jr. to ease monetary policy to help fund the war and domestic programs. Martin refused, instead raising rates, prioritizing concerns about an overheating economy over political pressure. His hawkish stance enraged Johnson, highlighting the core conflict between short-term political goals and the Fed's long-term mandate. Yet Martin wasn't rigidly inflexible. He occasionally compromised, such as yielding to Treasury pressures under Eisenhower in the 1950s, or cooperating with Kennedy's administration in the 1960s. Martin understood that central bank independence required diplomacy as well as resolve. To bridge gaps between the Fed and the executive branch, Martin established the Group of Four, an informal, high-level gathering of the Fed chair, Treasury Secretary, White House Budget Director, and Chair of Economic Advisors. These regular meetings fostered communication and helped manage tensions. a collaborative tradition that continues with modern Fed chairs. Martin's legacy is a demonstration that true independence isn't isolation. It's a dynamic balance, standing firm when necessary, but cooperating for stability. By the end of Martin's era, the Fed's independence had strengthened, showing the institution's progress in earning autonomy through both principle and pragmatic negotiation. The ongoing push and pull between the Fed's long-term discipline and the government's short-term needs remains a defining tradition, one that continues to shape the Federal Reserve's identity today. Presidents and Congress often resist Fed rate hikes for two reasons. High rates can slow economic growth, and they raise government borrowing costs, especially problematic during wars or heavy deficit spending. Thus, presidents pressure the Fed to keep rates low, particularly before elections and in times of fiscal stress. This tension peaks whenever the Fed tightens policy. Presidents routinely criticize rate hikes. They see them as direct threats to their economic agendas and political futures. Donald Trump, for instance, attacked Jerome Powell for raising rates, but praised him for slashing them during the pandemic. This pattern isn't unique to Trump. It's woven through decades of Fed-White House relations. William Martin, the long-serving Fed chair, fiercely defended the Fed's independence, often clashing with the White House. In 1969, as inflation rose, Martin hiked rates despite President Nixon's anger. Unable to fire Martin, Nixon announced his successor Arthur Burns ahead of Martin's term ending, effectively sidelining him. Burns, loyal to Nixon, cut rates and boosted growth, helping Nixon win re-election. This playbook, politically undermining an independent Fed chair, remains relevant. Many see echoes in recent tensions between Trump and Powell, speculating future presidents could similarly undercut Fed leadership. Arthur Burns' tenure is widely criticized for its lack of Fed independence. Secret White House tapes revealed Burns openly aligning policy with Nixon's wishes, lowering rates and supporting the president's political goals. The Fed's autonomy eroded, yet this period's excesses spurred reform. Watergate revelations about White House Fed collusion led to greater congressional oversight and eventual restoration of central bank autonomy. The political controversies of the Burns era spurred Congress to reassert oversight over the Federal Reserve. Introducing crucial reforms, the Fed's dual mandate, balancing price stability with maximum employment, clarified its mission. While new rules required the Fed chair to deliver biannual monetary policy reports and face questioning from both House and Senate committees, these public hearings transformed the chair's role, subjecting them to tough, high-stakes interrogations on policy decisions. The result? Increased transparency, accountability, and a reminder that as an independent institution, the Fed ultimately answers to the American people through Congress. While Burns' tenure exposed the dangers of a too-compliant Fed, it also set the stage for reform. The new framework enforced by Congress helped restore the Fed's credibility and independence. When Paul Volcker succeeded Burns, he ushered in a bold, principled era defined by a fierce fight against inflation, a sharp contrast to the political accommodation of the past. The Burns era is a lasting caution. While cooperation with the government is necessary, the Fed's duty is to uphold its mandate, not political whims. These hard-won reforms ensure that, going forward, the Fed's credibility and independence remain cornerstones of American economic governance. When Paul Volcker became Fed chair in 1979, the U.S. was mired in stagflation, high unemployment, and stagnant growth. Volcker responded with unprecedented resolve, hiking interest rates as high as 20% to crush inflation. His aggressive approach, known as the Volcker Miracle, succeeded. By 1983, inflation fell from 13.5% to 3.2%, restoring economic stability and global confidence in the dollar. The cost, however, was steep. Volcker's policies triggered a severe recession. Unemployment peaked at 10.8%, and countless businesses and farms went under. Public backlash was fierce, and both the Carter and Reagan administrations pressured Volcker to ease up. But Volcker refused to yield, famously declaring, "The Federal Reserve does not serve any political party," and even declined White House invitations to signal the Fed's independence. Despite short-term pain, Volcker's iron-willed leadership laid the groundwork for nearly 2 decades of economic growth and cemented the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency. His era marks the pinnacle of Fed independence, defining its modern commitment to price stability above political pressures. After Volcker, Alan Greenspan became Fed chair in 1987, serving for nearly 19 years. Unlike Volcker's bold decisiveness, Greenspan's trademark was ambiguity. His famously cryptic statements kept markets and policymakers guessing, granting him flexibility to adjust policy without rattling investors. Decoding his intent became a cottage industry, giving him immense influence over expectations. Volcker governed with courage and clarity, Greenspan with diplomacy and nuance. Both styles shaped the modern Fed, proving that leadership can take many forms, from principled resolve to strategic ambiguity. Volcker's era cemented the Fed's independence and anchored the dollar's global strength. setting a standard for future central bankers. His resolve showed that enduring short-term pain is often necessary for lasting prosperity, a lesson that remains vital for Fed leaders and policymakers today. Alan Greenspan, Fed chair from 1987 to 2006, became famous for his cryptic communication style, deliberately ambiguous, often leaving markets guessing. His quip, "If you think you understand what I said, then you must have misunderstood what I meant," captured his approach perfectly. This strategic opacity allowed Greenspan to manage expectations and navigate between the interests of markets and the government without locking himself into clear positions. Despite his enigmatic style, Greenspan skillfully balanced market needs and government pressures, maintaining Fed independence across 4 presidencies. His prestige grew to the point where even presidents were reluctant to criticize him publicly. However, Greenspan's leadership wasn't flawless. His embrace of deregulation, especially of derivatives, is widely seen as a factor that contributed to the vulnerabilities leading up to the 2008 financial crisis. Greenspan's era highlights that the Fed chairman's job is more than managing policy. It's about skillfully balancing the often conflicting pressures of markets and government. The chairman must maintain independence, ensuring neither side dominates. Greenspan's mastery of language and diplomacy exemplified this delicate equilibrium. Greenspan's emphasis on communication and expectation management remains a model for central bankers. Yet his missteps on deregulation underscore the need for vigilance and foresight. The chairman's role demands not just economic expertise, but also political savvy and adaptability. Greenspan's tenure teaches that while prestige and strategy can bridge divides, lasting success requires continual balance and independent judgment in an ever-changing landscape. The Fed chairman must walk a tightrope maintaining independence to preserve market trust while avoiding open conflict with the government. If the Fed sides too closely with the White House, it risks eroding market confidence in the dollar. Successful long-serving chairs like William McChesney Martin and Alan Greenspan mastered this balancing act, blending firmness with flexibility to earn credibility with both markets and politicians. During the financial crisis, the Fed under Ben Bernanke and Janet Yellen took extraordinary steps, slashing interest rates and launching quantitative easing. Conveniently, these policies aligned with the government's priorities, resulting in a rare period of harmony with little public friction. While formal independence remained, it's hard to gauge true autonomy when the Fed's actions so closely matched Washington's needs. The crisis also expanded the Fed's regulatory reach, especially after Dodd-Frank. Wall Street bristled at new rules, while some argued the pendulum had swung too far, burdening smaller banks. Initially, few objected as easy monetary policy benefited nearly everyone. But as the Fed began tightening policy post-2020 and maintained strict oversight, resistance grew. Donald Trump's attacks on the Fed focused on interest rates, but the larger battle involved regulatory authority. Under Chair Jerome Powell, the Fed sought to preserve its independence while facing direct political pressure and calls to relax oversight. The struggle over the Fed's autonomy remains a central challenge, underscoring that the chairman's true role is balancing shifting alliances between markets, politicians, and regulators. As economic and political landscapes evolve, the Fed's credibility will depend on its ability to maintain independent judgment while skillfully navigating the demands of both government and markets. The ongoing tension between independence and harmony will define central banking in the years ahead. During COVID-19, Fed Chair Jerome Powell worked closely with the Treasury to support the economy, raising questions about central bank independence. While these collaborations were necessary, they blurred lines between the Fed and the government. Powell also eased some regulatory requirements in response to political pressure, but maintained the Fed's core autonomy. Throughout its history, the Fed's independence has depended less on legislation and more on the judgment and skill of its leaders. Navigating the shifting dynamics between markets, the White House and Congress requires diplomacy and adaptability. As 2025 approaches and figures like Donald Trump remain influential, the challenge will be whether Powell and his successors can maintain the Fed's autonomy amid growing political pressures. Despite the Fed's structural independence, presidents including Trump possess tools to influence it. The ongoing tension between presidential power and central bank autonomy remains a defining feature of modern economic governance. Can Trump fire Jerome Powell? In practical terms, Trump cannot fire Fed Chair Jerome Powell without clear evidence of misconduct, a standard rarely met. The president nominates the Fed chair, but only Congress-confirmed terms and serious legal violations allow for removal. Powell's current term as chair runs until 2026 and even after. He retains voting rights on the Federal Open Market Committee until 2028. The Fed chair's authority is limited. Monetary policy decisions are made by the FOMC 12-member committee with staggered lengthy terms. 7 members are government appointees, but appointments come slowly, insulating the Fed from political swings. Presidents can influence the committee over time by appointing hawks or doves, but immediate control is impossible. Presidents may issue executive orders to increase federal oversight. For instance, Trump's Executive Order 14,215 required independent agencies to report regulatory plans to the White House, but notably exempted monetary policy, showing the limits of executive power over the Fed's core functions. Trump often criticized Powell and the Fed publicly, aiming to sway policy through public opinion. However, these tactics rarely affected Fed decision-making and sometimes only strengthened its resolve to remain independent. Ultimately, the Federal Reserve's structure long terms, collective decision-making, legal safeguards effectively shields it from direct presidential control. Despite attempts to pressure or influence the Fed, its independence remains foundational to U.S. economic stability. For over a century, the Federal Reserve has stood resilient against political and economic storms, protected by law and by the resolve of its leaders. Despite efforts from presidents like Donald Trump to sway policy or exert pressure, the Fed's structure and reputation have made it uniquely resistant to political interference. The real power behind the Fed is the trust of global markets, trust built gradually by leaders like Martin, Volcker, Greenspan, Bernanke, Yellen, and Powell. This credibility anchors the dollar's role as the world's reserve currency, surpassing even trust in the U.S. government itself. America's deep financial ties to the world through bonds, equities, and global capital flows rest on the perception that the Fed acts independently. Any threat to the Fed's independence, even just the perception of political interference, risks destabilizing that trust. The world doubts the Fed's freedom. The resulting shockwaves could undermine the dollar and shake the global financial system. Recent moves toward de-dollarization reflect rising concern about U.S. political unpredictability. As 2025 unfolds, the interplay between Fed independence and political pressure grows more delicate. The system's strength relies as much on perception as on reality. A loss of confidence in the Fed could unravel America's economic dominance. Trump's presidency highlighted this tension. His efforts to control the Fed ultimately met institutional limits, reinforcing the central bank's unique standing. The lesson is clear. The Fed's independence is not just a technical detail. It is the foundation of U.S. economic stability and global influence. Undermining it, whether by intent or recklessness, could trigger profound consequences. The future of the dollar and America's financial leadership depends on leaders' restraint and commitment to preserving this fragile, essential trust. Alright, that is all for this video. If you found this discussion insightful, remember to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more content. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.